I'm Inspector Morse, and I solve mysteries. Every silence hides a truth. Welcome to my new case.
Halloween settled over Oxford like a familiar grief. The ancient stones breathing their accumulated centuries into the mist-heavy air. I had retreated to my North Oxford flat with the particular resignation that accompanies autumn evenings, armed with a glass of claret that promised little and delivered less, and the evening crossword spread before me like a patient adversary. The wireless wandered restlessly between stations, catching fragments of undergraduate revelry from distant common rooms, then a thread of Bach that dissolved almost before recognition, leaving only the electronic whisper of empty frequencies. The fire had settled into comfortable embers, casting shadows across book spines that held more promises than I cared to examine. Outside, the city breathed with its medieval rhythm, each exhalation carrying the scent of wood smoke and the lingering traces of bonfires already surrendered to memory. I had reached that hour when solitude either becomes companionship or torment, and my disposition that evening leaned toward the contemplative rather than the morose. 7 across mocked me from the grid. Scholar loses head in strained arrangement. 8 letters. I circled it with the irritation of a man who suspects the answer hovers just beyond conscious reach. Then returned my attention to the wireless as it drifted through its nocturnal wanderings. It was then, emerging from static like a voice from deep water, that I heard something that made my pen pause above the crossword's stubborn geometry. SROM. Clear as cathedral bells, despite the interference, my own name spoken backwards with the deliberation of ritual or incantation. The word hung in the air of my sitting room. Neither accusation nor invitation, but something more unsettling, a recognition that the universe occasionally indulges in private jokes at our expense. I leaned forward, adjusting the dial with the careful attention one might give to a deathbed confession, but the voice had vanished, sinking into the electronic ether, leaving only the familiar hiss of empty airwaves and the distant sound of All Saints striking the quarter hour. Sleep, when it finally arrived, brought dreams of words tumbling backwards through time like autumn leaves caught in impossible winds. I woke to rain against the windows and the persistent ringing of the telephone, that modern intrusion that transforms peaceful mornings into the currency of other people's emergencies. Strange's voice carried the particular weariness of a man grown accustomed to death, arriving at inconvenient hours. There had been an incident at St. Bartholomew's College, he informed me with careful neutrality. Felix Hartwell, the college archivist and occasional radio presenter, had been found dead in the broadcasting studio during what should have been their Halloween transmission. Natural causes, the preliminary assessment suggested, though something in Strange's tone implied the natural order had been disturbed in ways that defied easy categorization. The crossword lay abandoned beside my cooling tea, and suddenly the answer to 7 across presented itself with the cruel clarity that solutions sometimes achieve. Stressed becomes deserts when the head is lost and the arrangement strained. I wrote it in with the satisfaction of a small victory, though the coincidence of solving it now seemed less triumph than omen. I dressed with the deliberate care of a man preparing for a performance, choosing the grey suit that had accompanied me through countless investigations. Oxford waited beyond my door, its medieval heart still beating beneath layers of scholarship and accumulated sorrow. The morning tasted of smoke and secrets, of celebrations concluded, and the peculiar emptiness that follows revelry. Coincidences, I have learned, are the universe's way of whispering that attention must be paid. When one's own name emerges from static on the very night a man dies in a radio studio, the whisper becomes something that only the deliberately deaf could ignore. Felix Hartwell awaited my attention, and with him, perhaps, an explanation for why the airwaves had chosen to speak my name backwards into the Halloween darkness. St. Bartholomew's College wore its autumn regalia with the quiet dignity of an institution that had witnessed the seasonal transformations of 6 centuries. The ivy cascaded down medieval walls in shades of rust and amber, while the quadrangle lawns accepted their scattered burden of leaves like pages torn from illuminated manuscripts. I crossed the ancient stones with Lewis. Our footsteps, creating a measured percussion against buildings that had sheltered scholars when the printing press was still a continental curiosity. The radio station occupied the upper reaches of the medieval tower, accessible by a spiral staircase that groaned with accumulated centuries. Each step upward seemed to compress time, carrying us through layers of academic history toward whatever revelation awaited in that cramped broadcasting sanctuary. The air grew thinner, redolent with the particular mixture of old electronics and older dust that characterizes spaces where human voices are transformed into invisible currents. Felix Hartwell sat in his chair before the microphone, as if he had simply paused mid-sentence to consider the precise weight of his next words. Death had visited him with unusual courtesy, leaving him arranged in an attitude of peaceful contemplation rather than the violent disruption that cardiac events typically impose. His spectacles lay folded beside a stack of typed scripts, and I found myself noting the deliberate care with which they had been placed, as though their owner had expected to retrieve them shortly. Dr. Sarah Blackwood arrived as we were examining the studio's modest geography, her sharp features animated by the intensity that medievalists bring to their scholarly obsessions. Her fingers bore the permanent stains of archival ink, and she moved through the cluttered space with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in similar academic sanctuaries. She explained that Hartwell had been unusually excited about his Halloween presentation, describing it as a special historical audio recording that would surprise his listeners. Lewis, with his characteristic attention to practical details, had already catalogued the evening's playlist. The handwritten schedule revealed an eclectic journey through classical fragments and readings from medieval manuscripts, the latter being Hartwell's particular passion. The scripts lay scattered across the desk like fallen leaves, annotated in his precise hand with the marginalia of a lifetime spent deciphering ancient texts. Several students had telephoned the college porter late the previous evening, Dr. Blackwood recounted, reporting strange whispers that seemed to emerge backwards from the static before the transmission cut to dead air. She dismissed this as undergraduate imagination influenced by the season, but her dismissal carried the slight hesitation of someone who had heard similar reports and found them troubling. The preliminary medical examination suggested heart failure, that common terminus for men of Hartwell's generation who had devoted their lives to sedentary scholarship. Yet something in the scene struck me as incomplete, like a musical phrase that resolves on an unexpected note. The half-empty teacup beside the microphone still held the ghost of warmth, and I noticed that the saucer bore the faint ring of an earlier cup, suggesting someone had used the good china earlier and rinsed it imperfectly. It was while examining the desk's accumulated detritus that I discovered the crossword puzzle, folded open to the evening's challenge from the Times. Hartwell had completed perhaps half the grid with his characteristic neat penmanship, but one clue had been circled in red ink with the deliberate emphasis of someone marking significance. 15 across, academic fraud concealed in ancient text, 9 letters. The answer space remained tantalizingly empty, though the crossing letters whispered possibilities that made my pulse quicken with recognition. Doctor. Blackwood observed my attention to the crossword with the sharp interest of someone accustomed to reading meaning in marginalia. She mentioned that Hartwell had been working on authentication problems involving recently acquired manuscripts, delicate questions of provenance that could make or destroy scholarly reputations. As we descended the spiral staircase, I reflected that truth, like ancient manuscripts, often reveals itself only to those willing to examine what lies beneath the surface text, where earlier words wait in shadow to be deciphered by patient eyes. The investigation deepened like autumn shadows, revealing layers beneath what had appeared a simple academic death. Felix Hartwell, I discovered, had been far more than Street Bartholomew's dutiful archivist. Within the specialized circles of medieval scholarship, his name carried the weight of genuine expertise, particularly in the arcane field of palimpsests, those manuscripts where earlier texts had been scraped away and overwritten, yet never entirely erased. There was something fitting in this specialization, I reflected, for a man whose own life was proving to contain hidden layers beneath its surface narrative. Dr. Blackwood received us in the manuscript room with the composed grief of someone who understood that sorrow, like scholarship, required proper methodology. Her relationship with Hartwell had been complicated, she admitted, using the word with the careful precision academics employ when personal and professional boundaries have blurred beyond easy definition. They had collaborated on a controversial authentication project involving recently surfaced manuscripts that possessed the troubling potential to challenge established scholarly consensus. The complexity of their partnership emerged, through patient questioning, like watermarks becoming visible under proper illumination. She spoke of intellectual passion and shared ambition, yet her eyes held depths that suggested their collaboration had encompassed territories that institutional protocols preferred to leave unmapped. Her ink-stained fingers worried at a handkerchief as she described Hartwell's growing excitement about what he termed breakthrough discoveries, documents that could reshape medieval studies if their authenticity could be established. James Thornbury appeared from the stacks with the nervous energy of a man perpetually apologizing for occupying space. The young librarian's stutter transformed simple sentences into exercises in patient endurance, but his intelligence flickered through the verbal obstacles with unmistakable clarity. He revealed that Hartwell had recently claimed discovery of what he called a significant historical fraud. Not the crude forgeries occasionally found in 18th-century collections, but something modern in its sophistication, crafted to deceive even expert examination. The accusation hung in the scholarly atmosphere like incense, heavy with implications that could destroy careers and reputations. Thornbury's distress seemed less about potential academic scandal than personal fear, as though the revelation threatened something intimately connected to his own fragile equilibrium. Professor Edmund Quine received us in his book-lined study with the theatrical timing that senior academics cultivate through decades of lecture hall performances. His dismissal of Hartwell's fraud allegations carried the particular contempt that long-standing rivals reserve for each other's obsessions. The claims were merely fantasies of an aging mind, grown suspicious through too many years, examining texts for evidence of deception, he declared with practiced disdain. Yet something in Quine's studied dismissal suggested rehearsal rather than spontaneous reaction. His contempt felt performed, like an actor who had memorized appropriate emotional responses but failed to inhabit them convincingly. When he turned pages to illustrate some medieval point, I noticed his hands' knuckles thickened with arthritis, movements careful. The index finger slow to uncurl. It was a small observation that filed itself away without permission. Hartwell's study occupied the older range, a room so meticulously organized it seemed almost performative, the order of a man who understood chaos too intimately. Index cards marched in precise formations along the shelves. Pencil shavings rested in a designated bowl, and the air held the medicinal tang of preservation chemicals and old glue. Lewis, examining Hartwell's personal effects with his characteristic thoroughness, made the discovery that transformed our understanding. The key ring attached to the dead man's belt contained keys for his office, flat, and various college areas, but conspicuously absent was the key to the locked filing cabinet that dominated one corner of the study. A fresher circle of untarnished brass on the ring suggested recent removal, and the cabinet itself stood like a sealed tomb, its contents as mysterious as any palimpsest awaiting proper technique to reveal its hidden layers. Lewis possessed the particular talent for uncovering connections that others overlooked, approaching investigation with the methodical patience of an archivist cataloging rare manuscripts. His inquiries revealed the existence of the Palimpsest Society, an informal gathering that met weekly to examine texts where earlier words waited beneath surface narratives like archaeological sediment. The society convened in a paneled room that breathed centuries of scholarship, where windows admitted light reluctantly and floorboards remembered the footsteps of generations. On the central table lay archival boxes with foam supports, arranged like surgical instruments, containing manuscripts recently donated by an anonymous benefactor whose generosity had arrived with carefully cultivated mystery. The membership formed a constellation of medieval expertise. Hartwell, with his gift for reading history's hidden layers, Dr. Blackwood with her passionate intensity, Professor Quine lending his senior authority with studied reluctance, and Dr. Margaret Ashford, a visiting scholar from Cambridge whose reputation in authentication techniques preceded her like morning mist across ancient stones. Dr. Ashford received us in the college's guest quarters with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to being examined as much as examining. Her expertise had made her invaluable to the Society's work, and she possessed that particular combination of intellectual precision and emotional restraint that Cambridge cultivates in its finest scholars. When she spoke of their weekly meetings, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned to guard words like state secrets. The donated manuscripts, she explained, had initially excited Hartwell beyond his usual scholarly enthusiasm. The collection spanned several centuries and contained previously unknown historical material, letters, chronicles, administrative records that could illuminate dark corners of medieval understanding. Yet his excitement had gradually transformed into something resembling moral distress. Hartwell had begun expressing doubts about authenticity, not the crude suspicions that obvious forgeries provoke, but deeper concerns about sophisticated deceptions designed to support particular historical narratives. His allegations were serious enough to threaten not merely individual reputations, but the integrity of medieval studies as a discipline. Dr. Ashford spoke of his growing isolation within the group, his suspicions hardening into accusations that made their weekly gatherings increasingly tense. Professor Quine had dismissed his concerns as the obsessions of advancing age, while Dr. Blackwood attempted to mediate between conflicting positions. The collaborative scholarship had devolved into something approaching academic warfare. Then, with a slight shift in her composure, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes, she revealed that Hartwell had threatened to expose the truth at a public lecture scheduled for the week following his death. He had planned to lay bare what he believed was deliberate fraud, regardless of consequences to reputations or the college itself. Her revelation carried undertones that suggested personal knowledge of such ethical conflicts. When she gestured to emphasize points, her hands moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to concealing rather than revealing emotion. There was something in her manner that caught my attention like a discordant note in familiar music. As she described Hartwell's final weeks, I noticed she unconsciously touched a fountain pen in her jacket pocket, the same shade of blue ink I had observed in corrections to the Society's minute book, though the minutes were officially recorded by the stammering librarian Thornbury. It was a small observation that filed itself away without permission, the kind of detail that often proves more significant than dramatic revelations. Dr. Ashford mentioned almost casually that she had been conducting comprehensive authentication analysis of the donated manuscripts, applying the latest techniques to establish their provenance. Her preliminary findings, she suggested with studied neutrality, might prove illuminating to our investigation. Walking back across the quadrangle as dusk caught in the gargoyles, I reflected on the curious magnetism of intellectual passion combined with emotional reserve. Dr. Ashford possessed both qualities in measures that made her simultaneously attractive and impenetrable, like a palimpsest whose surface text concealed deeper meanings that proper technique might eventually reveal. The anonymous donor, the questioned manuscripts, and Hartwell's fatal agitation were beginning to form a pattern, though one still shrouded in academic mist and personal mystery. The pathologist's telephone call arrived with the clinical precision that transforms speculation into certainty. Felix Hartwell had not surrendered to the familiar tyranny of cardiac failure, but to a rare compound derived from medieval manuscript preservation, chemicals, substances he had handled with reverent care throughout his scholarly career. The irony possessed a literary cruelty that would have amused him had he lived to appreciate the symmetry of being destroyed by the very materials he had used to protect ancient texts from time's erosion. I returned to the radio station because buildings, like reluctant witnesses, sometimes reveal their secrets when questioned twice. The medieval tower stairs protested under our footsteps. Each creak, a reminder of centuries accumulated in stone and timber. The backwoods whispers that had troubled Halloween listeners could no longer be dismissed as undergraduate imagination influenced by seasonal hysteria. In the technical closet, Lewis discovered equipment that transformed the mystery from supernatural to sinister. A sophisticated reel-to-reel recorder with custom modifications lay concealed behind boxes of replacement tubes and coiled cables. The technique, a specialist explained with unsettling enthusiasm, was called backmasking speech, recorded normally, then played in reverse to create those otherworldly whispers that had disturbed the broadcast. The machinery was far more complex than the station's usual broadcasting needs required, suggesting deliberate preparation rather than spontaneous deception. James Thornbury emerged from the library stacks with his characteristic air of perpetual apology. He admitted helping Hartwell prepare the Halloween program, arranging scripts and testing equipment with nervous efficiency. His denial of knowledge about backwards messages seemed genuine, though I noticed his hands bore faint smears of ferric oxide, the telltale residue of someone more familiar with audio tape than his stammering protests suggested. When his eyes involuntarily glanced toward the editing equipment, they recorded an intimacy that contradicted his claimed innocence. The mystery of Hartwell's missing filing cabinet key resolved through Lewis's methodical searching. We found it in Dr. Blackwood's office, resting in a small silver box with the casual intimacy of long familiarity. Her explanation carried reasonable authority. Hartwell had entrusted it to her for safekeeping during his recent anxieties about academic security. The brass showed a bright ring where it had recently been separated from its companions on a larger key ring, suggesting safekeeping of the hurried rather than planned variety. Professor Quine received our questions with the condescension of a man long accustomed to intellectual superiority. His laboratory contained the preservation chemicals used in Hartwell's murder, and his decades-long rivalry provided compelling motive. Academic animosity, he observed with studied irony, represented civilization's last acceptable warfare. The case against him assembled with textbook precision. Means, motive, opportunity arranged like evidence in a perfectly constructed argument. Yet something about this obvious solution troubled me like a crossword clue that yielded too readily. When Quine demonstrated his manuscript handling techniques, his movements betrayed the careful deliberation of someone managing arthritic joints. His fingers moved with the stiff uncertainty of corroded hinges, hardly the steady precision required for the intricate audio editing that had created those backwards whispers. The technical work demanded not merely knowledge but physical dexterity that age had clearly compromised. The red herring swam with obliging visibility, presenting itself with the theatrical convenience that should have satisfied any reasonable investigation. Quine possessed every qualification for guilt except the physical capability to execute the crime's most sophisticated element. The backwards messages suggested premeditation combined with technical expertise, a younger person's crime disguised as an elderly scholar's revenge. As Oxford's evening mist settled around the college towers, I reflected on the curious nature of academic murder. The killer had chosen weapons drawn from scholarship itself, transforming tools of preservation into instruments of destruction. The most effective deceptions, I had learned, often present themselves with seductive simplicity, like forged manuscripts hidden among authentic texts, waiting for patient examination to reveal their true nature. Professor Quine's study breathed the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades in medieval scholarship, its shelves ascending toward shadowed heights like cathedral buttresses, supporting centuries of disputed knowledge. The air carried the familiar perfume of leather bindings and old glue, mingled with the ghost of pipe tobacco and the faint medicinal tang of preservation chemicals that had become the signature scent of his scholarly domain. Rain traced intricate patterns against diamond-paned windows, while the coal fire settled into comfortable conversation with itself. He received us with theatrical resignation, installing me in a cracked leather chair before beginning his confession without prompting, as though the words had been rehearsed through sleepless nights. The professional rivalry with Hartwell had indeed spanned decades, he acknowledged with dry precision, beginning in their graduate years when they had competed for the same research fellowship and continuing through careers that intersected at every significant academic milestone. Rivalry was their curriculum, he observed with bitter humor, the only sport the years still permitted. The recent accusations possessed particular venom reserved for scholarly disputes. Hartwell had charged him with publishing research based on forged documents, not crude fabrications that occasionally surfaced in antiquarian markets, but sophisticated deceptions capable of deceiving expert examination. The allegations struck at the foundation of Quine's reputation, threatening to transform a distinguished career into an elaborate monument to fraud. Their final confrontation had erupted in this very room, Quine recalled with careful precision. Hartwell had arrived uninvited on a rain-soaked evening, bearing photocopies and authentication reports arranged like evidence in a prosecution brief. The discussion had escalated beyond academic disagreement into personal attack, with Hartwell threatening public exposure regardless of consequences to the college or their shared profession. Quine's alibi for Halloween night appeared unassailable. High-table dinner had provided him with the company of the master and several fellows, a gathering that extended well past the time of Hartwell's death. Yet something in his recounting struck me as rehearsed rather than remembered. When he described the evening's progression, his eyes focused on middle distance with the concentration of someone reconstructing rather than recalling. He mentioned stepping out between sherry and soup to retrieve a misplaced note for his grace, though the master typically spoke extempore. The timeline possessed suspicious precision, each detail arranged with the careful attention that anxious parties devote to establishing innocence. Lewis's methodical search of Quine's laboratory confirmed access to the rare preservation chemicals used in Hartwell's murder. Brown glass bottles lined shelves with orderly arrangement, each substance labeled in Quine's careful script: mercuric chloride, thymol crystals, phenolic mixtures whose fumes bit the throat. The professor explained their legitimate uses with scholarly authority, treating manuscript deterioration and stabilizing ancient inks. One stopper showed the bright ring of recent movement, and the glove box had lost a single right-hand pair. The case against him assembled with compelling logic. Motive sat in the armchair, old and threadbare. Means occupied the shelf beneath ruined bindings. Opportunity flickered in that elastic interval between courses. Lewis looked at me with the level gaze of a man who appreciates completed lists. Yet when I asked about the backwoods whispers that had crept through Hartwell's broadcast, Quine stared as if I had accused him of dancing. Editing tricks for boys, he dismissed with contempt. I watched his hands as he lifted his teacup with both, the left easing the right into the saucer's groove. A rubber sheath thickened his fountain pen's barrel. When he signed a loan form, the signature wandered toward the margin like a tired walker seeking rest. Arthritis announced itself in small humiliations, a wince when the latch resisted, buttons refusing their ancient pact. Backmasking required surgeons' steadiness and patience, sharpened by habit leader tape, angled precisely in splicing blocks, razor blades kissing acetate, tiny squares aligned along invisible pulses. Quine's hands could lift folios and point toward miscopied runes, but they could not, I realized, persuade tape to reassemble itself in deliberate reverse. The neatness troubled me. Oxford does not surrender its puzzles to syllogism. The stones themselves prefer ambiguity. The solution felt like a tutor's model answer, admirable in structure, yet fatally empty of life. Someone had chosen preservation as poison and radio as theater. Decisions suggesting a mind alert to irony and hands capable of exacting technical mischief. The case looked finished on paper. It refused, with academic obstinacy, to end. The crossword puzzle had haunted my evening like an unfinished conversation, its grid half-populated with Hartwell's meticulous script. I returned to his study as rain traced medieval patterns against diamond-paned windows, the air still holding the ghost of scholarship and the particular sweetness of rooms where time crystallizes into ritual. The circled clue waited with patient accusation. Academic's backward confession reveals hidden truth. 9 letters. The answer arrived with that peculiar clarity that solutions achieve when the mind stops forcing and allows pattern to emerge. Palimpsest, the manuscript where original text lies, scraped away yet never entirely erased, always visible beneath the surface to those who know how to look. Hartwell had marked this clue with red ink, the scholarly equivalent of underlining in blood, and suddenly the metaphor encompassed our entire investigation. The remaining clues yielded to methodical application, each answer filling its designated space with increasing urgency. Reading downward through the first letters of completed answers, the grid spelled out an accusation with chilling precision. Margaret. Kay knew. The crossword had become Hartwell's final scholarly exercise, encoding his suspicions in the same deliberate manner he had applied to medieval manuscripts throughout his career. Dr. Ashford received us in the manuscript room with the composed dignity of someone who had been expecting difficult questions. The space breathed centuries of accumulated knowledge, its shelves ascending toward shadowed heights like cathedral buttresses supporting disputed truths. When I placed the completed crossword before her, she studied it with the careful attention of someone reading her own indictment. Her confession arrived without theatrical protest, delivered in measured tones that suggested long rehearsal through sleepless nights. Years earlier, when her career balanced on the precipice between obscurity and recognition, she had authenticated manuscripts that her expertise should have identified as sophisticated forgeries. The documents had supported her groundbreaking research on medieval administrative practices, establishing her reputation and securing the Cambridge Fellowship that had defined her subsequent scholarly life. Hartwell's discovery of her complicity had transformed their professional relationship into something resembling intellectual servitude. He had never demanded conventional payment, she insisted, but had required her silence about his own growing suspicions regarding recent acquisitions. The arrangement had functioned with academic civility until Hartwell's conscience began asserting itself with inconvenient urgency, threatening to expose not merely his own doubts but the foundation upon which her career had been constructed. Her qualifications as a suspect possessed compelling logic. The threat of exposure would have destroyed the scholarly edifice built upon those early authentications. Her expertise in manuscript analysis provided both means and opportunity. She understood preservation chemicals with professional intimacy and possessed the technical knowledge necessary for sophisticated deception. The case against her assembled with textbook precision. Motive, opportunity, expertise arranged like evidence in a perfectly constructed argument. Yet something in her manner troubled me like a discordant note in familiar music. When she spoke of Hartwell's death, genuine grief flickered beneath her composed exterior. Her hands trembled slightly when she mentioned their final conversation, and her eyes held the particular exhaustion that accompanies authentic mourning rather than performed sorrow. I noticed she unconsciously touched a fountain pen in her jacket pocket, the same shade of blue ink I had observed in corrections to the Society's minute book, though the minutes were officially recorded by young Thornbury. The second red herring swam into view with obliging visibility, presenting itself with the same theatrical convenience that had made Professor Quine appear guilty. Dr. Ashford possessed every qualification for murder, except that final quality of inevitability that distinguishes truth from mere plausibility. Her responses seemed genuine rather than calculated, her distress authentic rather than performed. As Oxford's evening mist settled around the college towers, I reflected on the curious pattern emerging in this case. Each suspect presented themselves with such compelling completeness that their guilt felt almost scripted. Someone was orchestrating these revelations with the same methodical precision that Hartwell had applied to his crossword puzzle, leading us through a series of academic suspects like chapters in a tutorial on scholarly motivation. The real killer remained as elusive as the original text beneath a palimpsest, visible only to eyes that knew precisely where and how to look. Lewis possessed that particular genius for following paper trails through the labyrinthine corridors of corporate registration, pursuing anonymous benefactors with the methodical patience of a medieval chronicler. His discoveries had transformed charitable mystery into calculated deception, tracing the manuscript donation through several shell companies before arriving at the Thornbury Family Trust, established in 1952 with the discreet efficiency that old money prefers when concealing uncomfortable origins. James Thornbury received our questions in the library's hushed sanctuary, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge that seemed to press against him like accumulated guilt. The revelation hung between us like dust motes caught in afternoon light, illuminating secrets he had desperately sought to keep shadowed. His confession arrived in halting bursts, each word a struggle against the vocal impediment that had shaped every social interaction throughout his careful, quiet life. His grandfather, it transpired, had operated as a manuscript dealer during the uncertain post-war years when European collections were being quietly redistributed through channels that preferred discretion to documentation. The elder Thornbury had inhabited that grey territory between legitimate scholarship and outright fraud, selling authentic pieces to established collectors while occasionally enhancing provenance through creative documentation when circumstances demanded profitable flexibility. The donated manuscripts represented the final remnants of this questionable legacy, documents that James had been gradually introducing into the college collection through his privileged position as librarian. The process had required careful timing and strategic placement, slipping controversial pieces between established acquisitions where they might avoid immediate scholarly scrutiny. His plan had functioned with academic efficiency until Hartwell's expertise began questioning authenticity with inconvenient persistence, threatening to expose not merely the forgeries themselves, but decades of family involvement in clandestine trade. James admitted to creating the backwards whispers that had disturbed Halloween listeners, employing technical knowledge acquired through years of maintaining the college's aging broadcasting equipment. His familiarity with the radio station extended beyond official duties. He had spent countless solitary hours in that medieval tower, finding comfort in the mechanical precision of audio equipment that demanded no verbal interaction. The backmasking technique had seemed inspired, a method of creating supernatural confusion around Hartwell's death that would suggest otherworldly forces rather than human calculation. For a moment, the narrative seemed to resolve itself with satisfying precision, like tumblers clicking into place within a well-made lock. Motive, means, opportunity, all present, arranged with the neatness that crime occasionally provides when academic ambitions collide with family secrets. The quiet, stammering librarian, burdened by inherited guilt, driven to murder to protect a legacy built upon scholarly sand. Yet, as James attempted to explain the technical process of creating backwards messages, his stutter intensified beyond mere nervousness into genuine impediment. The clear pronunciation required for effective backmasking demanded precisely the linguistic fluency that his speech disorder made impossible. When I asked him to demonstrate by reciting a simple phrase backwards, his attempts dissolved into frustrated silence as consonants collided and vowels refused their proper sequence. The contradiction struck with uncomfortable clarity. The students had reported hearing his name spoken backwards with ritualistic precision, esrom, emerging from static with smooth malice. Such clarity required unwavering vocal control, the ability to pronounce words with ceremonial distinctness that would remain intelligible even when reversed. James's every stammering sentence belied such capability, revealing the speech impediment as a genuine neurological barrier rather than social awkwardness. The fourth red herring swam into view with the same obliging visibility that had characterized our previous suspect. James possessed motive, opportunity, and technical knowledge, yet lacked the fundamental capability to create the backwards messages that had made Hartwell's death seem supernatural rather than calculated. Someone else had borrowed his expertise while concealing their own involvement, using the young librarian's obvious guilt to mask more sophisticated deception. As evening settled over the college with its familiar weight of accumulated secrets, I reflected on the curious pattern that continued emerging. Each suspect presented themselves with such compelling completeness that their innocence felt almost as scripted as their apparent guilt. The real killer remained as elusive as original text beneath a palimpsest, hidden under layers of academic respectability and scholarly misdirection, waiting for more discerning eyes to reveal the truth that lay beneath these carefully constructed narratives. The detail had lodged itself in memory, like a splinter, persistent and irritating. During our first interview, Dr. Blackwood had quoted a line from a medieval manuscript with the casual authority that distinguished true scholars from academic pretenders. She had attributed the passage to a 13th-century Benedictine chronicle, yet something in the attribution had struck a discordant note that refused resolution. I returned to the manuscript room as November rain traced medieval patterns against diamond-paned windows, the air thick with that particular mixture of preservation chemicals and accumulated centuries that characterizes spaces where knowledge waits in patient rows. The donated collection lay spread across archival tables like archaeological evidence, each document a potential witness to deceptions I was only beginning to comprehend. The misquoted passage revealed itself with the cruel clarity that solutions sometimes achieve when the mind stops forcing connections and allows pattern to emerge naturally. The line existed not in any 13th-century chronicle, but embedded within one of the recently donated manuscripts, a document that purported to describe monastic life with suspicious literary sophistication. For a medievalist of Dr. Blackwood's caliber, such an error approached impossibility unless made with deliberate intent. The authentication records told their own story. Dr. Blackwood's signature appeared on certificate after certificate, her Cambridge reputation lending unassailable authority to manuscripts that her expertise should have immediately questioned. The handwriting analysis proved more revealing still. Corrections to the palimpsest society. Minutes bore the same dense blue ink I had noticed in her office, the same precise script that had labeled her filing systems with obsessive care. Hartwell's study yielded its secrets reluctantly, like a manuscript whose text had been deliberately obscured. Behind respectable academic volumes, I discovered a slim poetry collection, inscribed in a woman's careful hand. For your first small heresy, and for the courage to build on it. 1979. The dedication carried the intimate authority of shared transgression, love disguised as scholarly encouragement. A photograph tucked between journal pages completed the revelation, a Mayball print carefully edited to remove other figures, leaving only Hartwell in uncertain youth and a woman standing too close for mere collegiality. The scissors had preserved enough to convict, revealing Dr. Blackwood's profile with unmistakable clarity. The truth assembled itself with inexorable logic. Their relationship had been far more complex than academic collaboration, rooted in passion that had led to professional deception. She had forged documents to support his early research, believing herself to be nurturing genius rather than enabling fraud. The sophisticated manuscripts had been works of love, crafted with meticulous attention to paleographic detail and historical plausibility. When Hartwell's conscience began asserting itself with inconvenient urgency, questioning the authenticity of newer acquisitions, he had unknowingly threatened to expose not merely recent deceptions, but the entire foundation of their shared success. His growing moral distress had made him dangerous to the elaborate structure they had maintained through decades of careful silence. The misquoted passage was not scholarly error, but unconscious revelation. The forged text had infiltrated her memory so completely that she quoted it as authentic medieval wisdom. Only long familiarity creates such intimate mistakes, the kind that emerge when fabricated documents become more real than historical truth. As Oxford's evening mist settled around the college towers, I reflected on the curious alchemy by which love transforms into burden. Dr. Blackwood had committed her initial deception from fierce loyalty, believing she was ensuring proper recognition for genuine brilliance. The forgeries had succeeded beyond their wildest academic fantasies, establishing careers built upon scholarly sand that required constant vigilance to maintain. Hartwell's quest for truth had become archaeological excavation, disturbing sediments of the past that demanded terrible silence. His backwoods name whispered through Halloween static, now seemed less supernatural summons than guilty conscience made audible, the voice of accumulated deception finally demanding acknowledgement. The palimpsest metaphor had proven prophetic. Beneath every surface text lay earlier words, waiting for patient eyes to reveal what time and deliberate erasure had sought to conceal. The medieval manuscript room breathed centuries of accumulated silence, its atmosphere thick with the particular mixture of preservation chemicals and scholarly devotion that characterizes spaces where knowledge waits in patient rows. Dr. Blackwood sat among the donated collection with the composed dignity of someone who had been expecting this conversation, her ink-stained fingers resting on documents that represented both authentic history and elaborate deception. The afternoon light filtered through diamond-paned windows, casting shadows that seemed to dance between truth and fabrication, like marginalia in an illuminated text. I placed the evidence before her with deliberate care. The misquoted manuscript passage, the authentication records bearing her signature, the photograph that revealed decades of hidden intimacy. When I opened Hartwell's poetry collection to the incriminating dedication, she touched the inscription with the tenderness reserved for sacred relics, her eyes holding that particular exhaustion that accompanies the end of long deception. Her confession arrived without theatrical protest, delivered in measured tones that suggested rehearsal through sleepless nights. She had indeed poisoned Felix Hartwell, employing her intimate knowledge of preservation chemicals to create a murder weapon that would suggest natural causes rather than deliberate malice. The mercuric compounds used in manuscript stabilization could mimic cardiac symptoms when administered with professional precision, she explained, with clinical detachment, requiring only the expertise she had acquired through decades of archival work. The backwards message had been her most sophisticated deception, she admitted, with something approaching scholarly pride. Her collaboration with Hartwell on historical radio programs had taught her the technical skills necessary for audio manipulation, though she had never imagined applying such knowledge to murder. The backmasking technique had seemed inspired a method of creating supernatural confusion that would deflect investigation from human motives toward otherworldly explanations. She had learned the equipment's intricacies during their shared passion for bringing historical soundscapes to life, now twisted into an instrument of deception. She spoke of their relationship with the careful precision of someone describing archaeological findings. They had been lovers in their youth, united by passionate commitment to medieval studies and shared ambition that had gradually transformed into intellectual conspiracy. The forged documents had begun as acts of love, she insisted, created to support his early research when legitimate sources proved inadequate to his scholarly vision. Her motive was not greed or professional advancement, but something far more complex: love, intertwined with protective instinct and scholarly pride. She had killed him to prevent the destruction of their shared legacy, believing that some truths carried consequences too devastating to survive public revelation. Their careers had been built upon foundations of sand, yet the scholarship they had produced possessed genuine value that transcended its questionable origins. The irony emerged through her careful recounting, like watermarks becoming visible under proper illumination. Hartwell had not planned to expose her involvement in their decades-long deception. His growing conscience had led him toward a different resolution. He intended to take full responsibility for the forgeries, protecting her reputation while sacrificing his own career to the demands of belated honesty. His Halloween broadcast would have been his public confession, clearing her name while destroying himself with scholarly martyrdom. She had murdered him to prevent a sacrifice she had never been asked to accept, killing the man she loved to protect him from consequences he had willingly chosen to bear. The backwards whispers through Halloween's static had been her voice speaking his name in reverse, a technical accomplishment that masked genuine grief beneath layers of sophisticated deception. As Oxford's evening mist settled around the college towers, I reflected on the terrible mathematics of love, corrupted by fear. Dr. Blackwood had committed forgery from fierce loyalty, then murder from protective instinct, each deception building upon previous deceptions until truth became archaeologically complex. The manuscripts surrounding us seemed to whisper their own judgments, some authentic, some fabricated, all bearing witness to the human capacity for transforming scholarship into elaborate self-destruction. The case concluded not with revelation but recognition, the slow acknowledgement that academic passion, when divorced from ethical foundation, creates its own inexorable logic of deception and violence. In the gathering darkness, the medieval stones breathed their accumulated centuries, indifferent to the human dramas that played out within their patient embrace, while somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour with the measured authority of institutions that outlive their individual tragedies. Dr. Blackwood departed between constables with the composed dignity of someone whose deceptions had finally exhausted themselves, her ink-stained fingers carrying the last traces of a career built upon scholarly sand. The manuscript room felt suddenly diminished by her absence, as though centuries of accumulated knowledge had been tainted by the removal of a single corrupted presence. Lewis orchestrated the procedural aftermath with characteristic efficiency, transforming academic tragedy into administrative routine through the patient application of proper forms. The college would survive this tempest as Oxford institutions always do, absorbing shock into their ancient stones and continuing their medieval rhythms with institutional indifference. Committees would convene to discuss authentication protocols, careers would be quietly concluded or redirected, and the radio station would eventually broadcast different voices speaking different words. The manuscripts themselves would face renewed scrutiny, each document examined for the sophisticated deceptions that had fooled expert eyes for decades. Professor Quine would continue his arthritic decline among books that had outlived their authors, his rivalry with Hartwell concluded by death rather than resolution. Young Thornbury would face questions about his grandfather's questionable legacy, though his stammering innocence seemed genuine despite inherited guilt. Dr. Ashford would return to Cambridge, bearing uncomfortable knowledge about the limitations of authentication techniques when confronted by love, transformed into elaborate fraud. I remained in the manuscript room as autumn evenings settled over the quadrangle, contemplating the terrible mathematics by which passion becomes deception. The palimpsest metaphor had proven prophetic beyond Hartwell's scholarly imagination. His case revealed layer upon layer of overwritten truth, each generation of lies obscuring yet never entirely erasing what lay beneath. Dr. Blackwood had forged documents to nurture what she believed was genius, then committed murder to protect the legacy they had built together on foundations of academic quicksand. The evening's crossword lay abandoned on Hartwell's desk, and I noticed something I had previously overlooked. His final playlist, still clipped to the microphone stand, revealed its own hidden message when read vertically. The initial letters of each composer spelled palimpsest, missing only the final T. Whether this represented his growing awareness of their shared deception or her careful misdirection remained archaeologically complex, like the manuscripts themselves. The irony possessed classical cruelty Hartwell had planned to confess publicly, taking full responsibility while protecting her reputation. She had murdered him to prevent a sacrifice she had never been asked to accept, killing the man she loved to shield him from consequences he had willingly chosen to bear. Two acts of love, incompatible and deranged by the knowledge that truth, once released, acquires its own inexorable momentum. Somewhere in the distance, a college bell tolled the hour with the measured patience of institutions that outlive their individual tragedies. The bronze notes carried the authority of centuries that had witnessed similar human failures without losing faith in the possibility of renewal. I walked slowly through the quadrangle as darkness gathered in medieval corners, leaving the college to its ghosts and continuing stories. Oxford breathed around me with eternal rhythm, simultaneously ancient and ever-changing, holding its secrets close while preparing to generate new mysteries for future investigators. The stones beneath my feet had supported scholars for 6 centuries, absorbing their ambitions and disappointments with equal indifference. In medieval manuscripts, patient scholars could sometimes recover original words through careful application of ultraviolet light and chemical analysis. In human affairs, the underlying text remained forever visible to those who knew how to look, though the knowledge often arrived too late to prevent tragedy. The original crossword clue returned to memory. Academic fraud concealed in ancient text, 9 letters. Palimpsest had been the answer, but the true palimpsest was human nature itself, each generation writing over previous texts while never entirely erasing what had come before. Some truths are indeed too dangerous to reveal, though the danger often lies not in revelation itself, but in the accumulated weight of secrets carried too long through corridors that remember everything and forgive nothing.